Dark Souls has to be one of the most talked about games of the last decade. Its influence on game design and gaming culture has been immense, and for over 10 years now, YouTubers have been analysing every possible aspect of the game. And indeed, there's a hell of a lot of stuff to talk about with Dark Souls, like its lore, its gameplay mechanics, its difficulty, and much, much more. So why the hell am I making a video on it too? Do I have anything new to say? Some fresh new take on Dark Souls? No. I just like talking about interesting games that have made an impact on me, and no game has made as much of an impact on me as this one. I remember the first time I heard about Dark Souls, back when it was first released in 2011. I was just 19 and The Elder Scrolls Skyrim was due to come out in just 2 months, but I'd been hearing quite a bit of fuss about some other game that had just been released, which was reportedly A, hard as fuck, and B, really fucking good. I will say that I wasn't super into all this high difficulty chatter I'd been hearing about, because I'd never really been one for difficult games. I'd always been the dude who played games on normal difficulty, or even easy in some cases, because it had just never really occurred to me to seek out particularly difficult games, or choose the hard difficulty setting. It seems kind of lame thinking back on it, but it was just my mindset at the time. But I'd been hearing too many interesting things about Dark Souls, and 2 months till Skyrim would be released still seemed like a long time, so I picked it up to see what all the fuss was about. And what followed was several hours of frustration, outrage, and misery. I didn't understand the mechanics, I didn't know what the hell I was supposed to do or where I was meant to go. The movement in combat seemed absurdly slow and clunky. I kept getting my arse handed to me by the fucking skeletons, and the game was too bloody hard. Way harder than anything I'd ever played, to the point where I couldn't understand how it was getting all this praise, thinking that surely everyone must agree that this game was totally unfair and way too punishing, right? I remember feverishly searching gaming forums and complaining about the game to everyone because I was so pissed off that I couldn't play it properly and couldn't get anywhere. Yeah, I was kind of a lame little bitch back then, up until the age of about 23, and then I grew the hell up and became a decent person. When I look at the forums and comments and see people talking about how incredible and revolutionary the game was, it just made me more frustrated because I couldn't understand their perspective. I was too busy getting destroyed by the Balder Knights at the Undead parish. The peak of my frustration was when I reached the gargoyle boss fight and died again and again and again, getting more and more livid with each death. How the hell was anyone meant to beat this shit? Fuck this, I said. I've tried my best. I've put my time in and tried to understand and enjoy it, but I'm sick of it. As hard as I tried to beat it, it had beaten me, and I gave up and sold the game off on eBay. And that would be the extent of my initial stint with Dark Souls until a couple of years later. I was sitting in my room and looking for something to play, and for whatever reason, perhaps fate, which game should pop into my mind but Dark Souls? I thought, that game got sky-high praise back when it first came out, and as much as it frustrated me back then, it sure did seem novel and interesting, and so I bought it again, the Prepare to Die edition this time, and gave it another go. This time, things went very differently. I went in with a totally different mindset, being more open to the style of the game and accepting that it was hard and that I was going to die a lot and not understand everything. This time, I caught the bug. No, not AIDS, a different bug, the Dark Souls bug. I was enraptured by the game. I started to understand the combat and appreciate how deliberate and punishing it was. I began to relish the feeling of being lost in this dying, broken world, and I was hooked by the feeling of overcoming a difficult situation or boss. I couldn't wait to reach each next area, and when I got to levels like Sen's Fortress or Anor Londo, or came across some totally hidden area I would never have guessed existed, that shit was about the most fun I'd ever had in a game. It was magic. I'd caught the bug. Finally, I got what everyone had been talking about originally. Since then, I've genuinely lost count of the number of times I've beaten this game, but I'd guess it to be anywhere between 15 and 20 times. I also went on to fall in love with every game that FromSoft went on to release afterwards, even Dark Souls 2, especially Dark Souls 2, alright? Although my all-time favourite is still Bloodborne, and Elden Ring is also god tier. And so, That is why I want to make this retrospective on Dark Souls. It's because I have a history with it, because I've beaten it at least 15 bloody times, and because I love it. It's a hell of a game, so let's crack on with the video. A quick word about the structure of this video first. I will first provide an introduction into the world and setup of the game, then discuss the various key locations we explore on our journey, explaining the game's mechanics and systems along the way. Usually in my videos I'd end with a summary of the game's plot, but Dark Souls barely even has a plot. Instead, it has lore, and this ain't a lore channel, so although I will have a brief discussion about the world and lore, I won't get super in depth about it because there are many other better channels for that sort of thing. Dark Souls begins in a dingy, dark dungeon called the Undead Asylum. Its purpose is to hold undead who have gone mad, or hollow, in isolation, far away from the land of Lordran. See, as is the case with all the Soulsborne games, the world is in a terrible, broken condition. Civilization and society in Lordran are basically non-existent at this point, and it's rare to encounter a being or person who doesn't immediately want to tear us limb from limb. Perhaps the main reason for all this chaos and decay is something called the Undead Curse, the sufferers of which have an unsettling ring found upon their body, known as the Dark Sign. Those afflicted with the Dark Sign are doomed to live a life of undeath, meaning that they cannot die. Indeed, our own player character is an undead, hence why anytime we die, we return straight back into the world at the nearest bonfire. When the Undead Curse becomes even darker still, however, is when someone goes hollow. Going hollow is essentially when an undead has lived or died for so long that they've gone mad, or completely lost all purpose, hope, or humanity, now reduced to a frenzied fiend, doomed to an eternity of madness and undeath. Pretty dark stuff. And that brings us back to the Undead Asylum, where undead hollows are sequestered away from those not yet afflicted with the Undead Curse. Our character finds themselves in a locked cell, but then a kind soul and fellow undead drops us down a key from above. Important to note here that we don't actually play as a character in this game, and that we have no dialogue or actual personality. Rather, we create our own character at the start, and it's all in the hands of the player from then on. As we travel through the asylum, we see many examples of emaciated undead hollows, with some being non-hostile, while others will attack on sight. In the courtyard we light our first bonfire, with these acting as checkpoints each time we die, but thankfully I barely died at all throughout this whole playthrough. Travelling into the main hall of the asylum reveals a large, alarming figure poised for attack from the roof. This is where nearly all first time players of the game will get fucking destroyed by this hammer wielding demon with its big fat arse. But of course you're not meant to fight it, you're meant to run through this open gate. Further on through the asylum we encounter the very same undead who threw us down the key from before, named Oscar. Regrettably, Oscar is now mortally wounded, presumably from the asylum demon from before. He tells us that although he's done for, we should carry on with his mission and journey to Lordran to ring the Bell of Awakening. He then gives us another key, and also an Estus flask, which will of course serve as our main means of healing through the game. As we leave, we hear him pass on and die, although if you come back to the Undead Asylum later on in the game, Oscar will be here and attack you, having gone completely hollow. From here, having picked up a weapon and shield, we can carry on through the asylum and then attack the asylum demon from above, taking it down. Thus, the main obstacle preventing escape from the asylum has been felled, and now we are free to leave, being carried off the mountain by a large bird and spirited all the way to distant Lordran. From here, all we know is that we are to carry out Oscar's mission and ring the bell, or bells, of awakening, whatever that might entail. And that is the setup of the game. Of course, I'll talk more about the player's mission and the world and more later on, but for now I just want to talk about how the game starts. The Undead Asylum is a great opening level and tutorial of sorts because while it is pretty easy, it's also quite easy to die a bunch of times before you somewhat figure out the basic mechanics of movement, attacking and evading. There's still a mountain of gameplay elements to be encountered and learned of course, many of which may go unnoticed or misunderstood by many players, but the Asylum teaches you the basics. I didn't mention it before, but as well as tailoring your character's appearance at the very beginning of the game, you also choose a class and starting gift. Dark Souls is the kind of game where pretty much any class or build is viable, and that's one of the things that makes it so great. It also adds to its replayability, encouraging the player to try out different builds and weapons each time. For this playthrough I went with the Thief class for its high dexterity, and I'd be prioritising dex weapons for the whole playthrough. There are also a bunch of different options for ranged offense, like sorcery, miracles, pyromancy or bows, but for this playthrough I was a bit of a boring bastard and stuck purely with melee offense. Your character's starting gift is also an important choice because one of these options is quite different from the others. Well, there's also the pendant too, I suppose. But the Master Key in particular is extremely useful, opening many locked doors to higher level areas right from the start. It's actually so useful and I'm so used to using it that I endeavoured to not choose it for this playthrough, just for something different. But then I remembered that the Thief starting class automatically starts with the Master Key anyway, so it turns out I did choose it after all. Oh well. At this point it seems like nearly every damn thing from Dark Souls is iconic, from the image of the bonfire to the biggest bosses. But Firelink Shrine must surely rank up there as being one of the most loved and recognisable areas from any game, not least of all because of its soft, sombre music, and the roster of friendly NPCs which will gradually flock there as you encounter them out in the world. Firelink Shrine has also been endlessly praised over the way it connects to so many other parts of the world, even in ways which aren't initially obvious. However, I think the number of options open to the player from Firelink also contribute to how intimidating the game is to so many new people, because although there are 3 different directions you can travel in, those being the Catacombs, the New Londo Ruins, or the Undead Burg, for virtually any player just starting out, the correct option is the Undead Burg. The Catacombs are way too difficult at this point, and New Londo is also designed to be confusing and frightening. Too spooky for you, mate. Furthermore, there's a limit to how far you can even delve into these 2 levels before you'll just have to double back anyway. I remember trying to fight the skeletons in the graveyard on my very first playthrough and thinking, how the fuck are you meant to do this? This game's too hard, it sucks. Now of course, I know the answer is, you're not meant to do it yet. You're supposed to try it, get wrecked, and then realise that you need to travel in the direction of the Undead Burg, and probably still get wrecked, but regardless, that is where you should go. The movement in Dark Souls feels different to most other games, being far weightier and perhaps slower than I think a lot of people are used to the point where it felt strange, at least to me back then. There's a wee bit more input delay here than most games have, but once you adjust to it, it does feel pretty natural. Touches like the sound your armour and footsteps make when running also seem quite jarring at first, especially when you really pay attention to them, but after a while it all just adds to the unique overall flavour and ambience of the game. And of course, back in these days there was no jump, or at least not to the extent that we later saw in Sekiro and Elden Ring. Instead, you can only make a forward leap only from a sprint, and this has never really felt great. As players of games, we tend to like control, but once you've initiated your jump in Dark Souls, all control is lost until you've landed, and even then, there's an additional landing roll which has led to the quite literal downfall of many a player. Also, the button command to actually execute a jump is pretty terrible, requiring you to release the sprint button and then quickly tap it again for a jump, which can get awkward if you're sprinting in combat and you want to roll, only to do a jump instead and get wasted by an enemy because jumps have no invincibility frames. They fixed this in Dark Souls 2, mapping the jump onto L3 and then went back to the original crappy double tap command in Bloodborne for some reason, before finally giving you the option to choose either scheme in Dark Souls 3. Of course, sprinting, rolling and jumping are all actions which will consume your stamina, which is another defining attribute of Dark Souls gameplay: stamina management. Stamina management isn't too major a factor out with combat encounters though. Rather, when simply running around, it tends only to act as something which slows you down, sprinting until your stamina decreases, then jogging until it refills, and then sprinting again and repeating until you reach your destination. Now, among the many things which Dark Souls did remarkably well, level design is surely up there, and personally, I find many of the areas found in this game to be among the most enjoyable to traverse of any game. Anytime I start up a fresh playthrough, I can't wait to get to places like the Undead Parish, Anor Londo, or Darkfruit Forest, but even those highlights aside, Dark Souls' take on level design showcased a level of thought and refinement which many of us had never before seen in a game. Take the Undead Burg for example. Right as you enter, there's a super easy to miss section to drop down to, which I didn't even know existed until like my 5th bloody time playing through the game. Following this path will lead you to enemy ambushes and items, and then you drop back down to the original section where you started. Moving forward a bit as you enter a rundown house, and you'll see a gap which looks ripe for a jump, and so you'll try and make the jump and fail several times before giving up. You'll then progress in through the fog gate which exists to separate different sections of levels. There's no load screen or anything really associated with these gates, and once you pass through one it'll just disappear. In fact, I'm not really sure why they exist. Anyway, moving further ahead through the burg, as you shit yourself as a huge red drake lands on the bridge, making the ground shake and letting you know that you're probably going to be seeing this enemy again soon. Ahead of here has you light the first bonfire in the Undead Burg, and if you were anything like me the first time I played the game, this bonfire saw a lot of use. From here you can continue on ahead or travel back and take a side route where a couple of shielded enemies are waiting, and where some destructible crates hide the entrance to some stairs which will lead you down to a hidden merchant. And then from here you can move ahead to face another ambush, climb the ladder, and then from a roof see that same jump from before that you couldn't make, now conquerable because you took the time to explore. I'm not going to continue to run through every single section of the Undead Burg because I'm realising now that that'll take fucking forever. But my point is that you are instantly presented with secret areas, side paths, challenges, rewards for exploration, and obstacles which become traversable through exploration, all within just the first small section of this level. Ahead of this are more hidden items, shortcuts, traps, and imposing new special enemies. I think the placement of the Black Knight here is absolute genius. You see some stairs leading down and have a look and thinking there might be an alternative path forward or an ambush or item, and then you just see this terrifying knight standing there facing away from you. That last part is important because it puts the decision entirely in the hands of the player, whether they're feeling bold enough to take on this intimidating, unfamiliar enemy for potential reward, or play it safe and live to fight another day. And if you do decide to take it on, you might just pick up a sick new sword to try out to make the next chunk of the game way easier. All these elements and more really contribute to that special feeling you get when playing Dark Souls, especially the first half of the game, where you're still just developing your build and trying to find decent weapons and armour. While many other areas in the game do have a very different feel to an area like the Undead Burg, they mostly retain that same level of quality and mystery, and the feeling of fighting tooth and claw through an area and then opening up some shortcut to an earlier bonfire is so rewarding, or discovering that the level you're in is actually connected to a totally different area, which then connects to Firelink Shrine, making the whole game and world feel very well thought out and refined. Initially, the objective given to the player is to ring the 2 bells of awakening. Of course, there's no mission screen or objective marker here, but there is the crestfallen knight who'll drop a bit of info on where these 2 bells might be found. The first bell is found through the Undead Burg and into the Undead Parish, whereas the second one is found all the way down to the lower Undead Burg, then further down into the depths, then further down all the way into and to the bottom of Blighttown, and then a bit further down still near the entrance to the Demon Ruins. There's a pretty significant difference in the work required to ring these bells, with the second one being much more remote and hard to reach, and there's a very strong feeling of isolation once you get to the bottom of Blighttown. While you're in the Undead Parish, things are still somewhat bright and familiar, and you'll need a handy shortcut to Firelink Shrine, but the further down you descend through the depths in Blighttown, the more intense that feeling of, oh shit, maybe I shouldn't be here, how the hell do I even get out? There are no fast travel options for the first half of the game either, and so anywhere you go, you're going to have to find your way back again. To make a bit of a change to what I usually do on playthroughs, I decided to go through the graveyard and into the catacombs fairly early on. See, what usually happens is that people leave this area till later, as they should, and navigate their way through it, and then reach the pinwheel boss and destroy him within 15 seconds, and it's the easiest boss fight in the game. I thought I'd see how the catacombs felt at a lower level though, and see if Pinwheel might actually be a decent boss if you fight him early on. Well, I'll say this, you shouldn't do the catacombs early on. It's fucking brutal. Pinwheel still sucks, and you just need to backtrack all the way back to Firelink Shrine at the end anyway, so don't bother. I did pick up the great Seath weapon though, which was sick. At this point, before I get talking about the next parts of the game, it's high time I covered another core element of Dark Souls gameplay, the combat. The combat in Dark Souls is excellent. Okay, done. So after the bells have been rung, I'm just joking, let's get into the combat. The first time I played this game, like pretty much everything else it had to offer, I just didn't quite get it. The combat seemed so slow and clunky to me, just how long it took to perform an attack and the way you're locked into the full attack animation with no possibility of just rolling out of it. But later I realised that the most appropriate adjective to describe Dark Souls combat is this: deliberate. You can't run into a combat encounter just tapping buttons and rolling around like in, say, God of War, or you will die. And the main reason you will die is that in the event that you do get hit, you will get hit hard. I remember convincing a pal of mine to try this game, and indeed, he started it up and played through the Undead Asylum. And then he got to the Asylum demon, and I got a message from him saying something to the effect of, "What the hell even is this game? I lost half my whole health bar from a single hit." And I messaged him back saying, "Get good, pussy." But he did have a point. Most games will allow you to make mistakes. Most action games are designed with the allowance that the player will get hit a lot, but that is just part of the game. And indeed, Dark Souls is also absolutely designed with the understanding that you will get hit a lot and make mistakes, only less so compared to most other games. Even regular starting enemies can fuck you up with a basic attack, and you'll find no shortage of enemies that have the potential to kill you in just 1 or 2 hits. But this is all done to get a message through to the player. Be deliberate in your actions. Observe enemy movements and attacks and look for an opening. Don't just go in swinging and hope for the best. It's this which is key to making this game's combat feel as thrilling and satisfying as it does. It's because your actions really matter. This is why the movement has a somewhat sluggish feel to it, and why your character fully commits to the entire animation of every attack. It's to encourage the player to assess every combat situation and to choose the correct actions, because one sloppy action might just have you sent all the way back to the last bonfire, one step closer to turning hollow. I think the core combat here is also a perfect example of high depth, low complexity. Because leaving aside things like magic and pyromancy for a minute, there are actually a large variety of different core moves. You can perform a fast attack, a slow attack, a block, a parry, a roll, a backstep, a kick or a jump attack, and if the conditions allow for it, a plunge attack. Of course, there is sorcery, pyromancy and miracles as well as archery, but I would argue that these extra options add more to the depth than the complexity, in the same way that the massive selection of weapon types add to the depth. They give you more options, but those extra options aren't at all necessary to ever use if you don't want to. I finished this playthrough without touching any ranged attacks of any kind, whereas you can complete the game using only sorcery if you really want. Leaving aside bows and talismans and such, there are 15 different weapon categories in Dark Souls, with each category having anywhere between 3 and 20 different weapons each. Some of these weapons are super easy to find and available from near the start, whereas others you might never see unless you get lucky or know exactly where to look. For example, I'd literally never had this stone great axe drop before on any previous playthrough. Apparently it has just a 2% drop rate, and that's another thing I love. Most of the time, if you see an enemy with a weapon you like, they will eventually drop that weapon if you kill them enough and get lucky with a nice drop. You want that cool rapier used by the Balder Knights? Good, they can drop it. Or the Demon's Great Axe used by the Taurus Demon? They'll drop it. How about the outrageously cool Black Knight Greatsword? Yep, you can get it, and if you're lucky enough, you can get one near the start of the game at the Undead parish. Weapons of the same category will tend to have similar movesets, but often there will be differences too. Take katanas for example. The Uchi katana's strong attack is a thrust, whereas the Laito's strong attack is a forward slash. For as many different weapons as this game has, so many of them feel unique because they are unique. They have different base strength, stat requirements, durability, scaling, blocking effectiveness, movesets and range. As many times as I've beaten this entire game, and even though I platinumed the game on PlayStation, there are still some weapons that I have never gotten a hold of, like the Obsidian Greatsword or the Hammer of Vamos. The feeling of finding some new weapon and trying it out is great, and while some certainly stand out as being top tier, and looking at you Black Knight Halberd, you can win the game with literally any weapon. Anyway, sorry about that tangent on weapon variety, I'll get back to combat now. As well as offensive options like attacking, you do of course have a range of defensive options, and if you want to stand any chance of coming out on top with the game's harder encounters, you've got to get at least one or two of them down. The most well-known evasive manoeuvre that Dark Souls is somewhat notorious for is the combat roll. When an enemy is about to attack you, if you roll out of the way just as they're about to bring their weapon down upon you, you will not take damage. Seems simple, right? Seems obvious. Well, actually, I don't think rolls are all that obvious in this game, and in fact, I think the game does a very poor job at communicating out how they actually work, because the most crucial aspect when it comes to avoiding damage is something that the game never even hints at: invincibility frames. I don't know, maybe I'm just really dim-witted, you tell me. Actually, please don't tell me. But the presence of iframes in this game was a fucking mystery, for me anyway. I think I played my entire first playthrough without even realising that they were a thing. For anyone wondering what I'm even talking about, it doesn't actually matter if an enemy attack makes contact with your character model in this game, or any Soulsborne game. If you time your roll correctly, you will not take damage, regardless of whether you roll out of range of the attack or even roll directly into it. I know I'm not the only one who had trouble understanding this either, because I've spoken to 2 or 3 friends over the years about this game who had also played it, and they had no idea that iframes were even a thing either, because it's just not that obvious. But they are a thing, and they're really fun to pull off, and they're super important if you want to get good, as it were. Combat in Dark Souls, and indeed all Soulsborne games, often takes on a uniquely satisfying, rhythmic flow. Sometimes you don't even notice it happening, but you'll be halfway through a tough boss fight, deep in concentration, timing dodge rolls perfectly, going in for an attack when an opening appears, and it all just feels so tight, deliberate, and satisfying. An unfortunate downside to dodge rolls is that Dark Souls has some rather questionable hitboxes. I don't consider this to be a huge issue, because most hitboxes are actually really on point, but there are certainly some exceptions. For example, one enemy that I've never quite understood how to fight at close range is the Titanite Demon. Often you'll dodge one of its attacks seemingly perfectly, but still take a ton of damage to the point where I don't exactly know how to fight them properly. And then there's also bizarre moments like this. Or this attack from one of the worst bosses in the game. Like I said though, moments like these aren't super common, and God knows Dark Souls isn't the only FromSoft game with bullshit attacks. Your other 2 options for defense are the parry and the block. The main tool for blocking is of course a shield, however you can also block with a weapon if you happen to be two-handing it, though in most cases this will be way less effective than blocking with a shield. Back on my first playthrough where I literally didn't know how dodging was supposed to work, blocking was my main way of reducing and preventing damage. The game's many shields all have different stats for how much damage they'll absorb from enemy attacks, based on whether the damage is purely physical or fire, etc. Most shields will block 100% physical damage as a standard, but there are some which will only block the majority of damage while offering other benefits. For example, a shield I used a whole bunch for this playthrough was the target shield, and while it wasn't incredible at blocking damage, it was excellent at performing parries. Usually when I play this game, I dabble with parries a wee bit in the Undead Bargain Parish, and then don't really bother with them again, but for this run I used them a lot, and they are very fun to pull off, very effective, and surprisingly easy. It pretty much works as you'd expect, requiring you to trigger the parry animation in time with an enemy attack, leaving the enemy vulnerable to a high damage crit. Some shields give you a generous parry animation window, like the target shield or buckler, whereas others won't let you parry at all, like the pierce shield or the black iron great shield, with those instead offering other moves. Parrying doesn't work on every enemy in the game, but it works on a lot of them, including some you might not even realise. For example, did you know the Massive Knight and the Undead Parish can be parried? Something which contributes to all the satisfying decision making is stamina management. I mentioned it earlier when talking about stamina constraints while sprinting and jumping, but where stamina really comes into play is in the combat, because one factor among several which should discourage the player from attacking or rowing recklessly is the stamina bar. Although the stamina required for an attack differs widely depending on whether it's a fast or slow attack or a small weapon versus a heavy one, you'll only be able to launch a few attacks at most before your stamina bar will deplete, with rowing also using up a fair chunk each time it's done, limiting the extent to which you can take advantage of those sweet iframes. You always have to keep an eye on the stamina bar, because if it fully depletes, you've got to wait until enough of it has regenerated before you can pull off another move. Furthermore, if you only have a wee bit of stamina left and you pull off a big attack that would normally use up more stamina than you actually have, you'll be in a deficit by the end of the attack and have to wait extra long before your stamina bar will have regenerated enough to allow you to do much of anything. I remember a pal of mine who'd never played Dark Souls before saying that it didn't appeal to him because he wasn't into hack and slash games, and that friend knows who he is. Rory, if you're watching. He's probably not watching. But Dark Souls is not a hack and slash game. And no disrespect to hack and slash games, by the way. I'm not a snob when it comes to games, and Dark Souls isn't exactly niche nowadays, is it? But hack and slash implies a certain degree of mindless button mashing, trying to fit in as many attacks as possible to rack up hundreds of kills. Not this. So, let's get back to the journey of our undead. I'm aware that the structure of this video is a fucking mess, by the way, but, you know, who cares? After ringing both bells of awakening, the imposing iron gates into Sen's Fortress will open up. We can visit this locked gate earlier on, but can't actually go in then, though everyone's favourite anthropomorphic onion is to be found sitting here having a snooze. It's Siegmeyer. Sen's Fortress is one of the sickest fucking levels ever, but I know I wasn't the only one who found this fortress to indeed be nearly impenetrable the first time I played through it, dying over and over to Snake, Boulder, Arrow, Mimic, the Pit and the Pendulum. Once you figure out the correct way to go, it's really not so bad, but even now I can rarely get through this level without at least a couple of deaths. The upper level of the fortress is just as cool as the lower level, with a massive troll chucking great balls of fire at you. Cool detail about this level, by the way, is that you can actually visit the area you see in the cutscene where the gates of Sen's Fortress opens up, and even kill the troll there. Again, I think it took about 5 playthroughs before I realised you can get here. After being the boss on top of the fortress, and I'll discuss bosses in depth soon by the way, we unlock the option to travel to Anor Londo, with this area being disconnected from the main Lordran area, and only accessible via this point on Sen's Fortress. By the way, does this cutscene normally sound this bad? I've never noticed how crappy and basic the sound effects are here. Maybe it's the lack of music? Anyway, Anor Londo is hands down the sickest area in Dark Souls. It's grandiose, beautiful, and marks about the halfway point through the game. I remember back when I first got into the game, I was probably still on the Undead Parish or the Depths or something, and I saw a video of someone playing through Anor Londo, and I thought, where the hell is this level? This looks awesome. I think that's one of the reasons why this level stands out so much compared to the rest of the game. It's because it looks so elegant, bright and clean compared to the shabby ramshackle shanties of Blighttown or the ghostly flooded ruins of New Londo. Anor Londo also has one of the most notoriously hard bits of any Soulsborne game, and that is the Rampart Archer's part. Some folk have zero trouble with this and nail it on their first try and can't understand why people find it so hard, and then there's others who'll die 15 bloody times and get furious at this section. Truly, it's not that hard, it's just really intimidating. There are these two imposing silver knights who haven't appeared anywhere else in the game before this point, firing what are essentially spear-sized arrows at you from their great bows, all whilst you're running up a narrow rampart and then along a precarious ledge. But the trick is in the parry. You gotta parry the first one, and if it doesn't die to the critical, it'll probably fall off the ledge anyway. And then for the second one, carefully dodge its arrows, and then get another parry off. These guys will switch to their sword when you get within melee range, and they're really easy to parry due to how well telegraphed all their attacks are. The inside of the castle at Anor Londo is just as cool as the outside, with plenty more silver knights to fight as well as some nifty silver knight armour, which I happily donned for the remainder of the game, because it's sick. There's a Titanite demon in a cramped room in this place, which has to be one of the worst fights in the game, although it's totally optional at least. Seriously though, look at this fucking attack. There are a couple of really cool shortcuts in the castle, including the enormous door at the entrance, but also a very important blacksmith. I haven't really mentioned smiths yet, but they're vital for keeping your weapons in top shape. Weapons can be reinforced with Titanite shards, then large Titanite shards, and then Titanite chunks, then finally a Titanite slab, which are far rarer. Whereas Dark Souls 2 and 3 only let you reinforce up to plus 10, and Elden Ring let you reinforce up to plus 25, this game lets you go up to plus 15, and that goes for all your armour too. Although there are alternative upgrade paths which might require Twinkling Titanite, Demon Scales, Dragon Scales, Green Titanite Shards, Red Titanite, Blue Titanite, White Titanite. There's a lot of types of Titanite in this game. As well as reinforcing your weapons, they can also be modified to have other properties, like imbuing them with lightning or magic, or making them divine to cancel out the resurrection aspect of skeletons. This will also alter the scaling of your weapon, meaning that they'll either be stronger or potentially weaker depending on how you've allocated your stats. Also, some modifications can only be done at certain blacksmiths, and only once you've found and handed in the corresponding ember to the correct blacksmith, and only once you've reinforced your weapon enough. Like many of Dark Souls systems, they do not make it easy to understand, and often you'll simply have to look stuff up on the wiki to keep yourself right. As well as the wide range of possible modifications, you can also convert certain weapons into boss weapons if you have their corresponding soul. And so for this playthrough, I tried out the Life Hunt Scythe for the first time ever actually. Super sick weapon, except it causes bleed build-up on your character, which is problematic. However, I later solved this by wearing a blood bite ring and equipping the blood shield. Now that's what I call a build. Anyway, that brings us to the main boss of Anor Londo, Ornstein and Smo. Super cool boss with super cool designs, but also a bit of a fucking mess of a fight. Nonetheless, very fun and rewarding to beat, especially on your first playthrough. Also, has there ever been any other Soulsborne boss where the second phase is completely different depending on what you do in the first phase? Like most people, I tend to take out Ornstein first so I can fight Super Smo in phase 2, although every now and then I do change it up and fight Super Ornstein, and then usually regret it because he's bloody terrifying. If I had to pick my favourite thing to do in Dark Souls, it'd be fighting bosses. I love fighting bosses in this game because there are a ton of them, they usually have super cool designs, and I love the feeling of finally taking them down and getting that big satisfying reward of several thousand souls, plus the actual boss soul too in many cases. For me, the sickest boss in the game is probably the Iron Golem. I just love the way it stands there all motionless and imposing until you step into the arena, and then it starts hitting you with all these cool attacks. And while I'm on the subject of attacks, I need to shout out something about the game that I've always found really sets it apart from the many Souls-likes out there, and that is the quality and smoothness of the animations. Even here in Dark Souls 1, which is around 12 years old now, the animations look so incredibly good and well thought out. It's a big part of what makes the enemies and bosses so memorable in this game. Yes, the designs are fantastic, but also the way they move and attack, and also the sheer number of moves that so many And also the sheer number of moves that so many enemies have, many of which can be quite rare. For example, I'd literally never seen this poison attack from this snake enemy before. Been playing the game for about a decade and I didn't know they could do this. Also didn't know that Silver Knights had a proper backstab animation they could hit you with. No matter how many times you play this game, there's always some cool new detail you'd never noticed before. However, there are certainly some stinkers in here too. No prizes for guessing who I think is the worst boss in the game, because it's obviously fucking Bed of Chaos. Terrible, shitty boss that's a frustrating, obnoxious chore to play, and they even made the fucking run back long as hell. I can never beat this boss without at least a couple of deaths, and even when I'm not being pushed into some crack in the ground, I'm being relentlessly powered by its many other dumb attacks. It's a piece of shit and I don't like it. Another terrible boss is the Centipede Demon. The fight is just too damn chaotic, it's difficult to tell what it's even doing due to its crazy design, and I'm not a big fan of the whole "the floor is lava" thing either. Ceaseless Discharge also isn't great, but I don't mind it too much. It's certainly a spectacle, if nothing else. But other than that, the game's bosses range from decent to godlike in quality, and while the Iron Golem is my favourite, I do think Artorias is probably the best fight in the game, especially if you fight him on New Game Plus, where he's buffed up a bunch. One thing that sets Dark Souls 1 apart from the later Soulsborne games is that the bosses here tend to not have all that much HP, and it's very possible to really steamroll a lot of them if you have decent weapons, or if you're a magic user, which is essentially easy mode in this game. Even when I was fighting Ornstein and Smo here, it literally took just 5 minutes for me to beat Ornstein. On New Game Plus though, it's much harder to destroy bosses in quite the same manner, and you'll actually need to properly learn their movesets and openings. Once you beat ONS, we can pass through the doors into the bedchamber of Princess Guinevere, and So here we receive the Lordvessel, finally allowing us to teleport, although something I've never quite understood is that the selection of bonfires we can actually warp to seems completely arbitrary. For example, you can't warp to the Sense Fortress bonfire, or the Tomb of the Giants, or Blighttown. Why not? Beats me. But the feel of the game does change somewhat from this point on, because now, regardless of which ruin or dungeon you decide to delve into, you can always just warp right back out. Going back to Firelink Shrine now allows us to place the Lordvessel onto an altar deep below the shrine, and it's the serpent, Kingseeker Frampt, who kindly transports us down there. Although most folk will see this dude after ringing the 2 bells of awakening, and then continue to speak to him for the remainder of their playthrough, you can actually get on his bad side if you do things out of order. For example, if you beat the 4 kings without talking to him first, he'll just call you a fool and then leave forever. Lol. At this point in the game, the goal is to find and defeat the 4 lords to retrieve their lord souls and then place them into the Lordvessel. Thus, the choice is yours regarding which route you want to take first. There's the New Londo ruins, which leads to the 4 kings, the Demon ruins, which leads to Lost Izalith, terminating in the Bed of Chaos, the Duke's Archives, which leads to the Crystal Caves, terminating in an encounter with Seath the Scaleless, and then the Catacombs, which leads into the Tomb of the Giants, ending in a fight with Gravelord Nito. Now, many people consider this remaining portion of the game to be the weaker half, where the development got a bit rushed, leading to a noticeable drop in quality. I think I somewhat agree with this, however, even so, it's not like the game becomes shit or anything. It's still great, but yeah, not as good as stuff like Sense Fortress or the Undead Parish and everything. The Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith in particular are the messiest. The Demon Ruins itself is pretty damn fun with a bunch of bosses, but the way you've got tons of copy and pasted enemies just standing around looks a bit weak when compared to the far more well thought out enemy placements from earlier areas. Though it's when you get to Lost Izalith that this becomes ridiculous. What the hell even is this area? And why are there literally about 20 dragon arses standing around? To be honest, I actually kinda like these enemies, and their massive jump attack is a wee bit terrifying, because they jump really fucking high. But geez, this place is a bit of a damn mess, not least of all because of the molten lava everywhere that we can walk on because of the special ring we picked up earlier. Look, I know it's a fantasy game and everything, but the concept of being able to walk on magma because we have the correct ring on is just dumb. And also we still take damage, so our character is constantly engulfed in flame, with the damage sound just repeatedly playing. And then they cap it all off with the worst fucking boss in the series. I don't even really dislike this area, but there is a stark difference in quality here compared to most other areas. The New Londo ruins is pretty damn great though. Of course we can access New Londo very early on from Firelink Shrine, but it's generally not worth tackling at that point. Also, before being able to actually reach the boss of the level, you have to visit Darkroot Forest first and defeat the Great Grey Wolf Seath, who'll drop the Covenant of Artorias ring, allowing the player to traverse the abyss. Darkroot Forest is an awesome area with some of the best ambience of any area in the game, although the 2D trees do leave something to be desired. There's a bunch of shit to do here, including an optional boss, one of the coolest armour sets in the game, and of course the Hydra found at the bottom in Darkroot Basin. Now look, the Hydra looks incredible. I mean, you first come down here and see this massive multi-headed beast spitting enormous water projectiles at you. It's fucking awesome and intimidating as hell. However, in reality, the fight kinda stinks. You've just got to get up close to it to bait it into a physical attack and then attack its heads until they've all been cut off. In practice though, this is a clumsy and kinda tedious affair, especially when just one or two heads are left and they won't actually aim for you, but then you can't actually hit them without falling off the ledge because they're out of range. I had to resort to chucking bombs to beat this damn thing. Anyway, the whole Darkroot area is vintage Dark Souls, and there's a dense nostalgic magic about this whole level. Also, Seath is one of the best bosses in the game. It's a wolf with a sword, need I say more? Back to New Londo though, it's a very spooky area, and actually introduced an odd wee mechanic where you can't damage the ghost enemies or block their attacks unless you use the transient curse item, which will last just 5 minutes. There are no downside to using the transient curse on yourself, it's just necessary to stand a decent chance in this area, because there are a fuckload of ghosts here. Spooky. Once you reach the end of the upper section of New Londo, you can drain all the water from the lower level, revealing a whole new area below that you can now explore, and where a series classic enemy can be found, the Dark Wraith. Also, from here we can see that New Londo is actually connected to Valley of the Drakes. If you've got the Master Key, you can actually access the Valley of the Drakes quite early on, and it essentially just connects New Londo to Blighttown. It also has a fucking awesome zombie dragon encounter, which I died to twice, haha. The boss of New Londo is the Four Kings, and it can be a very tough one. It's something of a race against time too, because for every minute you spend fighting a king, another one will enter the battle, and just one of them is quite enough to fuck you up, sir. The one attack I hate in this fight is their homing magic projectile, because as far as I know it doesn't go away. You can keep dodging it, but it'll just swing back around, meaning that you essentially just need to tank the damage and fight on. One neat trick with this boss, however, is that even once one of them has been beaten, their hitbox will linger for a few seconds longer, allowing you to keep doing more damage. Sick fight. Then we have the Tomb of the Giants, and if New Londo spook you, you ain't seen nothing yet. To get here you need to pass through the catacombs, which is also a pretty tough area with a lot of skeletons, who'll infinitely respawn unless you either kill them with a divine weapon or take out the necromancer for that section of the level first. If you're lucky here, one of the several necromancers in the catacombs might be nice enough to drop a skull lantern to be used in the Tomb of the Giants, but unfortunately I wasn't so lucky. What I did have though was the Sunlight Maggot, which is even better to be honest, although the circumstances of me finding this piece of equipment were somewhat regrettable. The Tomb of the Giants is really fucking dark. It's dark as hell, and that's an issue, because this level is lousy with death pits, skeleton giants, and giant skeleton dogs. Even though I've played through this level tons of times before, I still always get lost, and even though there are, I think, 2 bonfires here, they're pretty damn hard to find. Although the Tomb of the Giants isn't a bad area, I kinda doubt it's anyone's favourite, because it's just such a pain in the arse to play through, bordering on being unpleasant. Thankfully the boss here, Gravelord Nito, isn't particularly difficult. You can absolutely get fucked up here, don't get me wrong, and I certainly took a bunch of hits, but Nito himself is very easy to fight at close range, and it's mainly the skeletons which will cause you grief here. And even that can be mitigated by not straying too much into the far side of the boss arena. The final main area of the game where the fourth lord can be found is the Duke's Archives, and I usually leave this place to last because I often find it to be pretty tough. The Archives are essentially a massive library with secret passages, multiple levels, revolving staircases, and one of the most irritating enemies in the game, particularly when they've been buffed by the Channeler. The Channelers usually give me a lot of trouble in the Archives, but my main weapon is buff as hell by this point, so I can one-shot them. Feels good, man. Although there's only one boss in this whole area, Seath the Scaleless, you actually fight him twice, although it's literally impossible to win the first encounter, which is a design choice I actually find pretty questionable, considering you might have a big stockpile of souls here, which you'll more than likely just lose, not to mention the fact that you can actually get cursed here too, taking away half your max HP, although thankfully that did not happen to me. The Archives can be a damn confusing place to navigate, though if you do ever get lost and frustrated, you can always take a minute to relax and look at the floating door in the sky that they accidentally left in. At the end of the Duke's Archives is one of the most beautiful areas in the game, the Crystal Caves. Although it might look stunning though, it's not really the greatest to actually play, because shit like this tends to happen all the time. Also, there are invisible paths here which you can detect either by dropping prism stones or by looking carefully at the sparkles dropping down from above. Or by just memorising where the paths are from previous playthroughs, I suppose. Seath the Scaleless is a pretty damn cool boss with a great visual design. I love big squishy creatures that I can lay right into. To damage him you have to first shatter the fragile crystal formation at the back of the arena, and only then is he vulnerable. Seath has a lot of wide-reaching AoE attacks, some of which can curse you if you're not too careful, although if you do get cursed you can actually farm the crystal clams outside the area for purging stones, not to mention twinkling titanite. And so, now that all 4 lords have been collected, these can be placed into the Lordvessel, opening up access to the Kiln of the First Flame, which leads to the final boss, Gwyn, First Lord of Cinders. But, of course there's some other stuff to take care of first, like optional bosses, optional areas, and the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. One of the greatest levels in the game, and apparently one of the first that FromSoft actually designed, is the painted world of Ariamis. It can be accessed by first picking up the peculiar doll after returning to the Undead Asylum, then interacting with the enormous tapestry in the Great Hall in Anor Londo. Very easy to completely miss all this, by the way, and I actually find it really cool and confident in the way the devs were happy to make decent chunks of the game easily missable and completely optional. The same can be said for the Great Hollow and Ash Lake, which are also very well hidden but well worth going to, because Ash Lake looks like this for God's sake. Pretty much one of the most incredible looking areas in Dark Souls history, so let's just hide the whole thing behind an illusory wall. I love it. But the painted world is a damned masterclass in level design. It is dense, challenging and layered, with memorable encounters, tons of hidden loot and a great level boss. By the way, how fucking creepy is the ambience in this specific part of the level? Just another thing to add to the list of cool shit I'd never noticed before. And while we're on the subject of tucked away content, there's also Gwyndolin, the Dark Sun. The path to this boss can only be accessed by finding this specific ring all the way down in the distant catacombs and then equipping it at this particular spot in Anor Londo, which will cause the statue of Lord Gwyn to fade away, obviously. The actual boss is pretty damn easy, but good fun nonetheless, and I like Gwyndolin because it's the same voice actor who plays Prince Lothric in Dark Souls 3.
Oh, dear brother, I'm on my way. My brother, unyielding sword of Lothric's prince, for that is our curse.
And that brings us to the DLC. Demon's Souls had no DLC, Dark Souls 2 had 3, Dark Souls 3 had 2, Bloodborne had 1 and Sekiro had none, and Dark Souls 1 had 1. What a confusing sentence. As is the convention in Soulsborne games, the way to actually access the DLC is in no way obvious. You first need to nail the Hydra in Darkroot Basin, and then leave the area and come back and walk behind the area the Hydra was guarding, and defeat the golden crystal golem, then talk to the woman who was trapped inside, named Dusk. Apparently a time travel from a different age. Then, for whatever fucking reason, you've got to go to the Duke's archives and beat this particular crystal golem who'll drop the broken pendant, and with this we can return back to where we freed Dusk and interact with an abyssal portal where we will be violently grabbed by Bayonetta and dragged back in time. If you know exactly what to do here, it's fine, but imagine trying to figure all this out without a guide back in the day. It's ridiculous. Anyway, as with pretty much every FromSoft DLC, Artorias of the Abyss is superb. It's very challenging, has a couple of the best bosses in the series, and boasts some really cool areas. The Ulysseal Township area in particular has a really thick, grim ambience to it, with the background noise sounding busy with buzzing, the twisted moans of the dark, afflicted populace, and distant feminine screams. The DLC also has one of the most badass cutscenes of any Soulsborne game, and that is really saying something. And if the Tomb of the Giants and New Londo weren't dark enough, an even darker area still is introduced here, the Chasm of the Abyss, being home to countless enemies who look nearly exactly like the humanity items the player can consume to restore their HP and increase their humanity counter. Humanity is another mechanic which just isn't really explained in game, and you could be forgiven for completing the game without really understanding it at all. Humanity can be used to reverse hollowing, turning you back into a human, which alters your appearance, enables online PvP or co-op, and allows you to kindle bonfires. Kindling increases the max number of Estus flasks that you'll get from resting at a bonfire, and an additional humanity can be used to kindle further, allowing for 15 or even 20 flasks if you're willing to throw in a couple of extra humanity, and if you've beaten Pinwheel for the rite of kindling. 20 flasks is a hell of a lot of flasks, by the way, and humanity really isn't very rare, so Dark Souls can be really generous with the amount of healing it will allow you. Not to mention that you can literally restore all your HP by popping a humanity at any time, of which you can carry 99, same with the Twin Humanities item. Dark Souls is filled to the brim with odd and experimental mechanics, and I'd highly recommend folk check out the channel Illusory Wall for a super detailed breakdown on how all this shit works, because there are multiple systems and mechanics you're very unlikely to gain much of an understanding of from even multiple playthroughs of Dark Souls. Anyway, yeah, the DLC is pretty damn sick, and the final boss of it, Manus, Father of the Abyss, can be a real bitch, especially with his savage combos. There is a cool wee mechanic here though, where you can create a brief force field around your character through the well-timed use of a secret item called the Silver Pendant, which is found through an illusory wall back in Ulysseal Township. Tough boss, but I somehow beat it on my first try here, somehow. And so with the DLC done, it is time to enter the Kiln of the First Flame. I feel like I've said this multiple times already, but yes, again, one of the coolest areas in the game. You'll find all 4 Black Knight variants here, carrying the Straight Sword, the Great Sword, the Great Axe and the Halberd. Great place for farming Titanite chunks too, by the way, and what's more is that I find myself some nice new armour. The one downside with this area is the fact that you have to run all the way back through it every time you die to the last boss, and Gwyn can be brutally difficult for a lot of people. In fact, me and a buddy actually did a Let's Play of Dark Souls many years ago, with it being his first time playing the game whilst I watched, and he ended up getting all the way to Gwyn without using any shields or armour, but then he literally could not beat him. Ever. The run ended there, because he just couldn't do it, and the long run back every time made the repeated attempts unnecessarily tedious. But Gwyn is an incredible boss fight, and crazy challenging if you're not using the parry strat. I kind of pushed out, I guess, and I did use the parry and the Hornet's Ring, so it was pretty easy for me. But if you're going to fight him conventionally, it is rough. He's probably the most aggressive boss in the game, hits hard as hell and has some really fast attacks. But when he eventually does go down, you are done, and you can choose to either take Lord Gwyn's place and link the fire, becoming the next Lord of Cinders, or reject linking the fire and bring about the Age of Dark. And I suppose with all this talk of linking the fire and whatnot, I should probably discuss the story, at least a little bit. See, I think I'm the same as the vast majority of Dark Souls players when I say that the first time I beat the game, I had zero fucking idea of what the hell it all meant, why my character was going around beating all these monsters, and what the significance of the ending was. And that's because of the style of storytelling used by FromSoft. The most lore you ever get given at one time is at the very start in that awesome intro cutscene. But after that, it is your job to glean tidbits of info from the NPCs of the world, the environment, and let's not forget reading item descriptions. You need to really work to figure out what it all means, who everyone is, and even how to interpret it, because you often don't get straight answers to a lot of questions. Here's what I'll say regarding the lore. I am not the type of player who has any interest in piecing things together to form my own theories, regardless of whether it's a game, movie or show. I let other people do that for me, and then I watch their stuff for my own entertainment. However, the beauty of Dark Souls and every other Soulsborne game is that as truly compelling and interesting as the story often is, you can completely ignore it and still have one of the greatest gaming experiences of your life. Time and time again, as I have, and will continue to. Even if you don't know shit about the story, it's still easy to be captivated by the elegant majesty of Anor Londo, or the dank gloomy depths of Blighttown, or the emotional face-off with Gwyn. For years I didn't understand the story, but I still loved the world, characters and pretty much everything else, so it didn't really matter, because although it's not a perfect game, and although there are certain elements that are a tad rough to return to, especially after getting used to the gameplay of Elden Ring, Dark Souls is one of the greatest games of all time. Which is basically my way of saying I can't be bothered trying to explain the story. Go and watch Video or something. And I guess that's a good place to end the video, I suppose. When I started this channel I didn't really ever plan to do a video on Dark Souls, but the time just felt right and it's a game I love to talk about, so I hope some folk got some enjoyment out of this. And with that I will say cheers for watching and cheerio.